When we talk about the dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant, the first place we need to begin is with intensity. Because let's be real, when someone identifies as a super empath, they don't just feel, they embody feeling. They walk into a room and you can almost sense their energy expanding, filling the space with an emotional charge that demands recognition. To them, it's not overwhelming, it's natural. It's how they move through life. They don't hold back their emotional truth because in their world, authenticity is not a luxury, it's survival. But to the avoidant, that level of exposure, that level of raw honesty doesn't feel safe. It feels like standing in front of a spotlight with no shadows left to retreat into. That's the first form of what we might call torture. Not intentional harm, not manipulation, but the unavoidable confrontation of the avoidant's greatest fear. Intimacy without escape. Think about this. The avoidant has constructed their entire relational identity on distance. They've learned that safety means space, that love often comes with conditions, and that the best way to protect themselves is to stay one step removed. Then here comes the super empath who doesn't play by those rules. The empath's intensity isn't asking for distance. It's pulling closer, leaning in, demanding presence. And for the avoidant, that presence feels like drowning in someone else's ocean when all they've known is the safety of standing on the shore. Now, why does this happen? Psychologically, an avoidant attachment style is born out of an early environment where emotional needs weren't consistently met. Connection became dangerous, vulnerability became unsafe. So they adapted, they learned to minimize, to detach, to rely only on themselves. But the super empath, they are the opposite. They often come from a history where they had to attune deeply to others' emotions to survive. They became specialists at reading the unspoken, tuning into subtle cues, amplifying their sensitivity as a tool. Put those two together and what you get is friction. The empath pushes forward with emotion while the avoidant pulls back. But here's the key, the empath's very existence doesn't allow the avoidant to escape the truth of themselves. It's like holding up a mirror that's so bright, so uncompromising, that the avoidant can't look away. And that mirror reflects back not just who they are, but all the things they've been running from. The longing they've buried, the pain they've numbed, the love they're afraid to want. The empath's intensity doesn't just expose the avoidant, it awakens them. An awakening, let's be honest, is painful. It shakes the foundations of their carefully constructed identity, and for someone who thrives on control and emotional distance, that loss of control feels unbearable. But here's the paradox, what feels like torture is also an invitation. Because in the presence of that kind of intensity, the avoidant is being given a rare opportunity to confront the very wounds that have kept them from true connection. They may resist it, they may run from it. They may even resent the empath for forcing them to feel what they've worked so hard to suppress. But deep down, something shifts. And once that shift begins, it's impossible to go back to pretending they don't need love, don't need intimacy, don't need to be seen. So the super empath doesn't torture through cruelty, they torture through truth. Their intensity strips away the armor, not because they want to cause pain, but because they can't not live in authenticity. And that authenticity is contagious. It forces the avoidant to reckon with the question they've been avoiding their whole life. What if I actually let myself be loved? And in that moment, the real torture isn't the empath's presence. It's the realization of how much the avoidant has been missing. That's the first crack in the armor. And once the crack is there, nothing will ever feel the same again. If the first layer of discomfort for the avoidant comes from being exposed to the sheer intensity of the super empath, the second layer is even more disarming. It's the moment the avoidant realizes that all the strategies they've built over a lifetime, the walls, the withdrawal, the silence, the carefully constructed fat 80, are completely ineffective against someone who can see straight through them. And that's exactly what a super empath does. They don't just hear words, they hear what's beneath the words. They don't just notice behavior, they notice the energy that drives it. They live in a constant state of emotional attunement. So when the avoidant tries to hide behind sarcasm, indifference, or coldness, the empath doesn't buy it for a second. They read the truth in the cracks and they mirror it back. For the avoidant, that's torture. Because their entire sense of safety depends on those masks holding up. Think about it. Most people in their lives will accept the avoidance phi 8 at face value. If they withdraw, people usually chase a little, then give up. If they go silent, people interpret it as disinterest and back off. If they deflect with humor or cold logic, others take it as part of their personality. But the empath, they know better. They see the pain hiding under the silence, the longing underneath the indifference, the fear behind the detachment. And the worst part for the avoidant is this: the empath is usually right. This dynamic is powerful because it disrupts the avoidant's carefully controlled narrative. The avoidant has told themselves a story their whole life, that they don't need too much, that they're fine on their own, that intimacy is optional. And most of the time, people reinforce that story by accepting the distance at face value. But the super empath introduces a completely different storyline. They respond to the avoidance withdrawal with patience, to their indifference with understanding, and to their walls with unrelenting truth. The empath doesn't confront aggressively. They reveal gently, almost invisibly, simply by refusing to be fooled. And suddenly, the avoidance story doesn't hold up anymore. That's where the torture comes in. Because once someone sees through your defenses, you can't hide behind them with the same confidence. It's like wearing a mask your whole life and suddenly meeting someone who can see your face no matter what disguise you put on. It creates a kind of nakedness that is deeply uncomfortable. The avoidant feels exposed, and exposure is the one thing they've worked their entire life to avoid. But here's the irony. As painful as that exposure is, it's also the only path to freedom. Because the mask that feels like safety is really a cage. It keeps the avoidant from being abandoned, but it also keeps them from ever being truly loved. And when the super empath pierces that mask, it hurts, but it also liberates. It gives the avoidant the first glimpse of what it would feel like to be fully seen and still accepted. And that possibility, as terrifying as it is, becomes impossible to forget. So when we say a super empath tortures an avoidant by unmasking their defenses, what we're really saying is this: the empath refuses to let the avoidant settle for a life of half-truths and emotional distance. They drag the truth into the light, whether the avoidant is ready or not. And while the avoidant may resist, deny, or even push the empath away, the seed has already been planted. Once you've been seen, you can never fully go back to hiding. The empath's gift is clarity, and clarity is the one thing the avoidant cannot defend against. And in the end, the real torture isn't that the empath sees the avoidant too clearly. It's that the avoidant starts to see themselves. When we move into the third layer of this dynamic, the torture takes on a very different form. It's not loud. It's not confrontational. It's quiet, steady, and relentless. And that is the super empath's consistency. See, most people who encounter an avoidant eventually give up. They hit that wall of distance, that cold front of detachment, and they retreat. They think, well, this person clearly doesn't care enough, and they move on. And the avoidant counts on that. In fact, it's part of their unconscious strategy. It confirms their worldview. See, people always leave. I was right not to trust too deeply. That belief becomes their safety net. But a super empath doesn't play that game. They don't retreat at the first sign of coldness. They don't run when the avoidant goes silent. Instead, they remain calm, patient, present. They show up with a steadiness that the avoidant cannot process because it directly contradicts the script they've been living by. The empath says without words, you can push me, but I won't disappear. You can withdraw, but I won't abandon. You can test me, but I won't break. That level of consistency disarms the avoidant in ways they can't even articulate because it leaves them with nowhere to hide. Now here's the psychology behind it. An avoidant survives by predicting abandonment. If they believe rejection is inevitable, then distance becomes logical. But when the empath refuses to conform to that script, it creates dissonance. The avoidant is left with two conflicting realities: the old one, where everyone eventually leaves, and the new one, where someone stays no matter how many walls are thrown up. That contradiction destabilizes them. It's torture not because the empath is trying to cause pain, but because the avoidant is forced to confront a possibility that terrifies them. The possibility that love might actually be unconditional. And let's be honest, unconditional love sounds beautiful in theory, but to an avoidant it's frightening. Because if someone stays, if someone truly commits, then intimacy becomes unavoidable. And intimacy is where their deepest fears live. It's where the old wounds of rejection, abandonment, or neglect come flooding back. That's why the empath's patience feels unbearable at times. It corners the avoidant into facing what they've avoided for decades. It says, I see you, I'm not leaving, and now you have to decide what to do with that. The empath's consistency is not passive, it's active. It's not weak, it's powerful. It's a form of strength that communicates, I won't abandon you, but I also won't let you abandon yourself. And the avoidant feels this not just as pressure, but as revelation. They start to realize that maybe all those years of pushing people away weren't about strength, but about fear. They start to see that the very walls they believe protected them have actually kept them isolated. And once that realization hits, it can feel like a trap. Because the empath has shown them the possibility of connection, and once you've tasted that, you can't unknow it. That is why the consistency of the empath is its own kind of torture. It holds up a mirror day after day, moment after moment, say, I'm still here. What are you going to do now? And for the avoidant, that choice becomes unavoidable. Run and confirm your fear, stay and confront your wounds. Either way, the presence of the empath forces growth. So the trap isn't one of manipulation, it's one of love. A love that refuses to leave. A love that refuses to bend to fear. A love that stays steady until the avoidant finally sees that distance is not the only way to survive. And in that realization, the real torture becomes the awareness that escape is no longer an option. And this brings us to the final layer of this dynamic, the one that cuts the deepest. Because once the avoidant has felt the intensity of the empath's presence, once their defenses have been unmasked, and once they've been held in that steady consistency they can't shake off, something begins to happen that they can't run from. They are awakened to accountability. And that is the most uncomfortable form of all. See, the avoidant has built their identity around escape. Escape from closeness, escape from vulnerability, escape from responsibility for how their actions impact others. When they feel uncomfortable, they withdraw. When they feel threatened, they shut down. When they feel too much, they numb. That pattern works for years, sometimes decades, because it shields them from ever having to confront the truth. But the super empath doesn't allow that cycle to remain intact. Their very presence is a challenge, A spotlight, a living reminder that running is not the same as healing. And here's the thing, accountability isn't about blame, it's about truth. It's about standing still long enough to admit, yes, this wall I've built protects me, but it also hurts the people I love. Yes, this silence keeps me safe, but it also leaves someone else starving for connection. Yes, this withdrawal spares me pain, but it also prevents me from experiencing joy. The empath forces the avoidant into that recognition, not by preaching, not by demanding, but by simply refusing to play the game of distance. They stand in their authenticity, and that authenticity reveals the avoidance for what it really is, fear masquerading as control. That is why the empath's presence feels like torture, because it dismantles the illusion of power the avoidant has been holding on to. For the first time, they can't just point to the other person and say, "You're too much, you're the problem, you're the reason I pull away." With a super empath, that excuse falls apart, because the empath is not chaotic, they are grounded. They are not manipulative, they are transparent. They are not careless, they are intentional. And that forces the avoidant to face the one truth they've been dodging their whole life. The problem isn't always out there, it's in here. Now, this is where the paradox shows up. Accountability is painful, but it's also liberating. When the avoidant begins to accept responsibility for their patterns, they step into a new kind of power, the power to choose differently. They start to see that their past does not have to dictate their future. That the walls they built to protect themselves as children are now the very structures holding them back as adults. And here's the beauty, the empath doesn't just expose this truth. They hold space for it. They don't say, "See, I told you so." They say, "I see who you are, and I believe you can be more." And that belief plants a seed of transformation. The avoidant may resist, they may fight it, they may deny it for as long as they can. But once accountability has been awakened in them, it cannot be silenced. They will hear it in the quiet moments. They will feel it in the relationships they enter. They will sense it every time they pull back and realize that avoidance is not peace, it's emptiness. And once that awareness sets in, running no longer feels like freedom. It feels like a prison of their own making. So yes, the super empath tortures the avoidant, but not by cruelty, not by manipulation, not by force. They torture by awakening. They torture by holding up a mirror so honest, so clear, so unshakable, that the avoidant can never again hide behind their old story. And the greatest torture of all is also the greatest gift, the realization that they are responsible for their own growth, their own healing, and their own ability to love. And once that realization takes root, the avoidant is left with only one choice that truly matters: evolve, or remain imprisoned by the walls they built. Because in the end, the real torture isn't the empath's presence. It's the awareness that they can no longer lie blind to who they really are.